Hello everyone and welcome to the history of Russia. As usual, I'm Damon and this is episode 78, Death, Madness and Banishment. Oh, and I've forgotten to say this the last couple of times. Thanks for listening in. Okay, so last time we got stuck into the 7 Years' War and saw how in late 1757 the Prussian king, Frederick the Great, wiped the floor with the French and the Austrians, and to a lesser extent the Swedes, whilst Russia remained on the sidelines after Field Marshal Apraxin's somewhat mystifying retreat. This week we'll be putting the 7 Years' War to one side, whilst we concentrate instead on events that took place in Russia during 1757 and 1758, which, in no particular order, include the reasons for and the political and personal fallout from that Russian withdrawal, Catherine and Stanislaus's ongoing affair, the Empress Elizabeth's health, and Peter's pro-Prussian leanings. Okay, that's the preamble over with. Let's strap ourselves in and do some history of Russia. I will ease ourselves in by once again taking a brief look at what was going on between the Grand Duchess Catherine and her Polish lover Count Stanislaus Poniatowski. Poniatowski, as we know, had returned to Russia in 1756, and during the first few months of 1757 it looked like nothing special was happening. But something special must have happened, because by the start of summer Catherine was showing the early signs of pregnancy, and in December she gave birth to a daughter. And so here we go again. Who was the father this time around? Well, it was almost certainly Poniatowski. Catherine certainly thought so, but as with the birth of her son Paul 3 and a bit years previously, Peter was somewhat reluctantly persuaded to accept the child as his. And, as per the last time, as soon as the child was born, she was whisked away by the Empress, and Catherine hardly ever saw her. Catherine had wanted to name her daughter Elizabeth after the Empress, but Elizabeth overruled her, and the child was named Anna after Elizabeth's late elder sister and Peter's mother, Anna Petrovna. By all accounts, young Anna was a weak and sickly child, and unfortunately she was to live for just 15 months. She died in March 1759, and in her memoirs, Catherine never made mention of her again. We'll hear more about Catherine and Stanislaus a bit later on, but for the time being, though, we need to nip back to the late summer of 1757 and look at the fallout from the Russian army's retreat. So, if you recall, Field Marshal Stepan Apraxin had led his troops west, taken Memel, won the Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf, and then, with the road to Königsberg open, had, to everyone's surprise, returned east, claiming that he was out of both ammunition and supplies. Or he'd heard about Elizabeth's collapse at the church service, and knowing that the pro-Prussian Peter was next in line, should the Empress die, didn't want to be in East Prussia at the head of a Russian army. Or he'd been ordered to retreat by Elizabeth when she had attended a meeting of the War Council and discovered that the army was out of ammo. Whatever the reason, when Apraxin returned, he was relieved of his command and placed under house arrest to await further questioning. But before we get to the whys and wherefores and what happened next, we need to look at a couple of underlying items such as Elizabeth's illness and Peter's pro-Prussian mindset. Now, we don't really know how serious the Empress's latest health scare was. Had her collapse at the church been due to one of her dizzy spells, or had it been a minor stroke, or was it something else that couldn't either then or now be diagnosed? We'll never know. However, I suspect that while she was not in general a well woman, and was bedridden for long periods, she was A, not at death's door, not yet anyway, and B, she was able to attend council meetings, whisk a baby away, relieve a field marshal of his command, and, as we'll soon see, get closely involved in matters of state security. And then we have Peter's pro-Prussianness. How deep did that run, and how had it come about in the first place? Well, it ran pretty deep. Peter, who, remember, was half German, had been born and brought up in Germany, speaking German, and when he was summoned to Russia at the age of 14 to become his aunt's heir, he'd been like a fish out of water. And as the years went by, his feelings didn't really change, and he grew to hate everything to do with Russia, its strange traditions, its equally strange way of doing things, its perceived backwardness, its harsh climate, and its impossible language. And then, of course, not too far away was Frederick the Great. King of Prussia from 1740, Frederick, in Peter's eyes, was the shining example of what a ruler should be. German, of course, absolutist yet enlightened, efficient and organised, and, as we've seen, a military genius. Everything, in fact, that the toy and real soldier-loving Peter, in his role as the Duke of Holstein and later as Russian Tsar, aspired to be. And everyone suspected when the day came, when Elizabeth died and he took over, that Peter would rip up the Russian treaties with France and Austria and sign a new one with Frederick. So the Empress's health and her heir's pro-Prussian sentiments were important themes, and anybody who was anybody in the Russian court would certainly have had them in mind. And Apraxin and his boss Bestujev, who were both at the time pretty important anybodies, would have been keenly aware of them and ready to react to any changes. But I somehow doubt that Apraxin, hearing news of Elizabeth's collapse, would, off of his own bat, have turned the army around and started marching back towards Russia. Surely he would have checked with Bestujev or anyone, before undertaking such an action. I think we can probably rule out the portly and rather cautious Field Marshal deciding to retreat, again, solely on his own initiative because he'd run out of ammunition and supplies. Again, he would have checked in first. And I'm pretty sure that's what he did do. He sent word back to St. Petersburg regarding his situation. The War Council debated it, looked at their options, and decided that the best thing was to order a retreat, which Elizabeth apparently did without telling Bestujev. There. That wraps up things rather nicely, I think. Or does it? If the War Council had ordered the retreat, and Apraxin complied with their instructions, why then was he relieved of his command? Well, reasons for that decision could be that Apraxin had decided to retreat under his own steam, either because of Elizabeth's health and Peter's pro-Prussian tendencies, or because he was out of ammunition and provisions. But whilst that could be true, I don't think that they were the reasons for the loss of his command and subsequent house arrest. I think that the real reason for Apraxin's downfall was caused by the pressure exerted from Russia's allies, and, most notably, by the French. Enter, stage left, France's new ambassador to Russia, the Marquis de l'Hôpital. The Marquis had arrived in St. Petersburg in June 1757. He had quickly got to grips with the political situation in the Russian capital, and he had established close ties with Bestujev's pro-French enemy, Vice-Chancellor Mikhail Vorontsov. From L'Hôpital's and his country's perspective, Apraxin's retreat came just at the point when the combined forces of France, Austria, Russia and Sweden were just about to inflict real damage to Frederick, and the ambassador was understandably furious. So furious, in fact, that he demanded an explanation for the Russian army's withdrawal, and said that if he didn't receive a satisfactory answer, then he would start to deal with Bestujev and not Vorontsov. This placed the Vice-Chancellor in a bit of a quandary. He didn't want the French in hock with Bestujev, and he didn't want to explain to d'Hôpital that it had been Elizabeth's decision to order Apraxin's retreat. And so I'm of the firm opinion that Elizabeth and Vorontsov decided that Apraxin, along with a couple of others, was to be the fall guy. But why do I think this? Well, during Apraxin's subsequent questioning by Alexander Shuvalov in January 1758, he wasn't even asked for the reasons behind the retreat. Instead, he was questioned about who he had communicated with as he made his way back to Memel. The field marshal swore that he'd received no directions from anyone other than the Empress. Well, apart from the 3 letters he'd received from the Grand Duchess Catherine, which he handed over to Shuvalov and which Shuvalov then passed on to Elizabeth. What then happened to Apraxin is a bit of a mystery. One version of the story, the Robert Massey version as outlined in his biography of Catherine the Great, is that he remained under house arrest for the next 8 months, and then in August 1758 he was put on trial for his supposed misdeeds. When the judge came to wrap things up, he said, "And there now remains no course but," and Apraxin, fearing that the following words were to be either torture, exile, or maybe even death, immediately dropped dead on the spot. The other version simply has Apraxin dying in prison under mysterious circumstances before he even came to trial, which, given the circumstances and the political ramification, seems the more likely. Either way, by August 1758, he was yesterday's problem. And that, I think, is a good time to pause things and take a short break. Okay, I'm back. Someone else who was yesterday's problem was our old friend, the British ambassador, Sir Charles Hanbury-Williams. Now, as we know, after Great Britain had signed its deal with Prussia in January 1756, thereby negating the agreement that the British had signed with the Russians the year before, Sir Charles had stayed on in St. Petersburg and had maintained close relationships with both Bestuzhev and Catherine. The trouble was that everything that Bestuzhev or Catherine said or wrote to Sir Charles had then been passed on to Frederick the Great of Prussia. However, during the summer of 1757, the French ambassador, the Marquis d'Hôpital, became suspicious of his British counterpart, and although he was unable to obtain any hard evidence, he made his feelings known to Vorontsov, and when Vorontsov discussed things with Elizabeth, neither of them could see any reason as to why Sir Charles should continue to be in Russia. And so in September 1757, St. Petersburg informed London, about a year later than it probably should have done, that its ambassador's presence was no longer required. When London sent the dispatch recalling Hanbury-Williams, he was a relieved man. Over the past year and a bit, the strain of being a double agent had weighed heavily on his shoulders. His health had started to suffer. He was drinking too much, and his nerves were frayed. And in October, he said his final goodbyes and departed Russia a broken man. But things were to get worse. After a long and arduous sea trip back to Britain via Hamburg, his physical and mental health completely disintegrated. He would spend the next couple of years in an institution as a mentally deranged invalid before dying, probably by suicide, in November 1759. Incidentally, the British King George II, probably feeling at least partly responsible for Sir Charles's demise, ordered that he was to be buried in Westminster Abbey, which was nice of him, wasn't it? Okay, it's time to take stock. Elizabeth isn't a well woman, but she's able to function and she's still very much in charge. Peter is very pro-Prussian and Frederick the Great is his idol. Apraxin's retreat was sanctioned by the Empress, who then put the Field Marshal on trial to save face with the French. And finally, and sadly, Apraxin died and Sir Charles Hanbury-Williams went mad and also died. What have I missed? Well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, who were the couple of others that I mentioned a few minutes ago? And secondly, what has become of those 3 letters? As we know, Elizabeth had never really, on a personal level, been that fond of her Grand Chancellor, but for the last 16 years she'd been able to put that to one side, mainly because Bestuzhev was a skilled, organised and effective political heavyweight who had maintained Russia's position as a European power albeit a slightly fringe one, whilst at the same time keeping it out of costly and potentially destabilising conflicts. However, now she wasn't so sure. Who had appointed Apraxine? Bestuzhev had, and in the aftermath of the Field Marshal's retreat, she was starting to listen more intently to those that said that Bestuzhev hadn't acted in either hers or Russia's best interests. Why had the army run out of ammunition in the first place, and why had the campaign been so poorly planned? So who did those voices belong to? Well, the Shuvalovs and Vorontsov had been lobbying against Bestuzhev for a number of years, but now pressure was also coming from the French and the Austrians, both of whom were openly questioning Russia's appetite for the war against Prussia. Plus, there were the rumours that Bestuzhev was anti-French and anti-Austrian. Partially true, he was certainly anti-French. That he was receiving money on the side from the British. Probably true. And that he had formed an alliance with Catherine, who he planned to put on the throne when Elizabeth died. Definitely true. And it was the last of those rumours, the Bestuzhev-Catherine relationship, that worried the Empress the most. Why? Well, A, there was a suspicion that something untoward had taken place. Elizabeth now possessed the letters that had been sent by Catherine to Apraxine, and she believed, rightly as it happened, that these had been written and sent at Bestuzhev's urging. And B, because Peter, whatever his faults, was the rightful heir, and if he didn't or wasn't allowed to succeed, then her life's work and her legacy, the continuation of the Petrine-Romanov line, would be in danger of turning to dust. And so in mid-February 1758, she decided to act. On the 14th, Bestuzhev, who for the past few weeks had been effectively persona non grata, was summoned to a hastily convened meeting of the War Council. He sent a message back stating that he was too ill to attend, but this excuse was rejected. Either you come now voluntarily under your own steam, or we'll drag you here. When he eventually arrived, the Grand Chancellor was arrested and stripped of all of his offices and titles. The next day, Catherine received a note from Poniatowski informing her of Bestuzhev's arrest and urging her to be wary and careful. A couple of days later, another message was received, this time from Bestuzhev himself, via a couple of his contacts and Poniatowski, which told Catherine to stay calm and not to worry, because prior to his arrest, he'd been able to burn all of his papers, including the document regarding the succession, which, if you remember, had suggested that Catherine and himself would be in charge, with Peter as their puppet or figurehead. Relieved and somewhat emboldened, Catherine decided to get on the front foot. She had found out, again from Poniatowski, that a commission had been set up to look more closely into Bestuzhev's affairs, and so she went to one of the commissioners, Prince Nikita Trubetskoy. Now, the prince was an ally of the Shuvalovs, but he was known to be fair and generally honest, and so Catherine asked him point blank what in God's name was going on. Trubetskoy's reply hardly threw any further light on the matter. All he said was that the commission to investigate Bestuzhev had been ordered from the top, and that it would be looking into the Grand Chancellor's affairs in an attempt to reveal criminal activity. Which meant that as of yet, nothing to implicate Bestuzhev or Catherine for that matter had been found. However, and isn't there always a however, a few days later, Catherine received a note from Poniatowski, which stated that one of Bestuzhev's servants had been caught trying to smuggle a letter, and that he and several other Bestuzhev contacts had been arrested. Now, this was bad news, A, because Catherine and Poniatowski now had no way of communicating with Bestuzhev, and B, they had no knowledge of what the unsuccessfully smuggled letter contained. And then, to top it all off, Stansislaus revealed that Elizabeth had sent a formal request to Augustus III asking for Poniatowski to be recalled. Catherine now realised that she could be in trouble, probably quite serious trouble. Bestuzhev must have said something. Either that, or Elizabeth herself had started to put two and two together. Without knowing which was true, she decided to follow the Grand Chancellor's lead and so she burned all of her official papers and documents, including her journal. By the end of the month, though, it was clear that the commission investigating Bestuzhev was struggling to come up with any hard evidence related to his supposed crimes. First of all, the commission had published a document stating that Bestuzhev had been arrested and questioned for, in their words, attempting to sow discord between the Empress and Peter and Catherine. And then secondly, they requested that every Russian diplomat, ambassador or envoy was to send them every piece of correspondence that they had either received from or written to the Grand Chancellor over the past 2 decades. The Commission hoped that once they received this amount of paperwork, then they would be able to show that Bestuzhev had countermanded Elizabeth's direct orders. But there were 2 problems with this approach. One, Elizabeth never signed or wrote anything down. All of her orders and directions were verbal, so how could anyone know or prove that Bestuzhev had acted against her wishes? And 2, to obtain the information from people who had in the main worked loyally for Bestuzhev, and then carefully analyse and dissect it, was going to be a colossal task that would probably take many years to complete. In the end, the Commission's orders were effectively ignored, and although it rumbled on for the remainder of 1758, it found no evidence to implicate the Grand Chancellor of any further crimes, and by 1759, both it and its investigations were quietly dropped, and Bestuzhev was banished to one of his country estates, where he would remain for the next 3 years until, well, we'll come to that in due course. But in March 1758, Catherine could have known none of this, and in her mind, she could either do nothing and hope that any suspicion of her would quietly blow away, or she could get on the front foot and bring things to a head. And it was to be the latter course that she would take. Why? Well, attack was the best form of defence. She'd tried this approach with Elizabeth before, and whilst it had been painful, it had eventually worked. And if she were to do nothing, then her lover, Poniatowski, would be sent back to Poland, and she would be alone again and at the mercy of her husband, Vorontsov, and the Shuvalovs. So Catherine knew what she wanted to do. What she needed to work out now was the how. But to find out what that how was, you'll have to join me next time, because for this episode, it's a wrap. So until next time, dear patrons and listeners, you know the score. Heads down, chins up, look after yourselves, and most importantly, stay as safe as you possibly can.